Please welcome Father Tad.
Thank you all very much. Tremendous pleasure to be able to be with you today. The general approach that I like to take when we talk about embryonic stem cell research is to review a bit of the science, ask some basic questions. What are stem cells? What are some of the sources that you can obtain them from? And then use that basic foundation in science to then launch us into a discussion about the ethics, about what's right and what's wrong, about what kind of science we should be doing, and which kinds of science should we be scrupulous to avoid because of the grave harms that can follow. All right, so let's start right at the beginning here. I want to ask you, what is a stem cell? And the way I want to ask it is like this. Let's imagine that I scrape some skin cells off of my wrist and we put them into a petri dish. Okay, so now you have these skin cells and they're growing on their own. And then imagine we have a second petri dish next to it that has some stem cells. So skin cells and stem cells. What's the big difference between those two petri dishes? Anybody like to put up their hand and, take a stab at that one? What's the difference between the skin cells and the stem cells? Yes. Good. She said a skin cell can only stay as a skin cell. That's right. It's kind of stuck in a rut. It can only make one type of cell. It is not capable of differentiating in other directions. Now, what about the other side? What about the stem cells? What can they do? Anybody? Yes. Good. They can develop, she said, into any kind of cell. In other words, their chief virtue is that they're really flexible. So when you have a stem cell, for example, a plate of them here, the idea would be you could force them to become nerve cells or perhaps become muscle cells or pancreatic islet cells. You remember what these are? These are the cells that are damaged when you have diabetes and they don't function properly. So the idea is you have kind of a blank slate cell that you can push it in all these different directions. And this is really a neat idea because if you can do that, then you should be able to take some of these differentiated derivatives, as we call them, and perhaps put them into the body. Maybe somebody who has Parkinson's has injury to a particular locus in the brain, or after a heart attack, you could put in fresh heart muscle cells that would help the heart to beat better. Or for a diabetic, you could use the pancreatic islet cells in order to be able to reconstitute the lost regulation of blood sugar. So this is really a powerful idea. I mean, this idea that you have a blank cell that you can train it or make it do what it is you would like to, and in that way, you can carry out a type of medicine that we call regenerative medicine. And this is a vastly expanding area now, a very exciting, fast-moving area of modern medicine. All right, this is kind of a giveaway question. Where do embryonic stem cells come from? Because the answer is contained in the question, of course. They come from embryos, and specifically from embryos that look like this. This human embryo that we're looking at is about 5 days of age. Just a few hundred cells, all told. And as you look at it, you notice there's an outer ring that ends up forming the placenta, the support structure for the growing baby. But you also notice right here, you have a little cluster of cells growing in the middle. That's called the inner cell mass. That is kind of the business end of the embryo from the point of view of this gives rise to the baby, to the fetus proper. It also turns out that these are the cells from which you get embryonic stem cells. But in order to get those cells, you must necessarily destroy that embryo. The embryo does not survive the extraction process. So this already moves us in the direction, as you can tell, in the direction of having a discussion about the ethical concerns. This embryo is called a blastocyst at this early stage of about 5 days of age. So the basic question here then becomes, all right, human embryos are required. Where do they come from? Sometimes people have a mistaken idea that the human embryos would be taken out of women. That's not the source of the embryos for embryonic stem cell research. Rather, you make the embryos in the laboratory when you are doing the process of making test tube babies. And there's a whole nother ethical discussion of the concerns and problems, moral concerns that are raised by using that technology to do in vitro fertilization. But we won't discuss that today. I do a whole another talk, separate talk on that topic. But in vitro fertilization is the starting point to get the embryos. So what ends up happening is when you make embryos for in vitro fertilization, many of them will be stored in these cryogenic storage containers. These have liquid nitrogen, extremely cold, and preserve the embryos. And if those embryos don't end up being used for family building later on, they will be taken out, grown a little bit further, and then you destroy the embryo and get the stem cells. And when you do this, you end up with something that's called a stem cell line. A line. Now, what is a line, a cell line? Well, a cell line is a preparation of cells that basically grows forever. Because let's go back earlier when we were talking about the skin cells that we scrape from my wrist. If you grow those in that petri dish, they will not grow forever. They'll only grow maybe 50 or 60 divisions all told. But if you destroy the human embryo and successfully set up a stem cell line, those cells will keep on growing and dividing, and basically in perpetuity. We don't believe, as long as you take care of them, split them into fresh plates when they outgrow the bounds of the old one, as long as you feed the cells, etc., then they will continue to grow basically forever. So if you destroy even a small number of embryos to get stem cells, you then have a preparation that you can work with for many years. All right, 1998. I want you to think back to that time. This was the first time that they ever destroyed a human embryo and successfully got stem cells. This was done at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, by Dr. Jamie Thompson. And when he did this, he kind of became an overnight scientific superstar, made the cover of Time magazine. His laboratory in Wisconsin now receives multi-million-dollar grants to push forward this kind of research. And so this sort of launched the national discussion because people said, well, now we know how to do it. Should we? Is this right? And the ethical discussion then became very, very intense, as I think most of you are aware. Now, as this whole discussion ramped up, Hollywood and various other political personalities became involved in the discussion. I'm going to run a short video clip here of somebody who I think you'll recognize right away. He and his wife were both very active promoters of human embryonic stem cell research.
Embryonic stem cell research can sound complicated, but the bottom line is that these tiny cells hold the promise to treat and potentially cure diseases and disorders that have touched all of our lives: cancer, heart disease, juvenile diabetes, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, ALS, autoimmune diseases, and perhaps even spinal cord injuries, just to name a few. And no matter what your party affiliation is, you can support the needs of patients in this country. Individuals such as Nancy Reagan, Gerald Ford, Senator Orrin Hatch, and Jimmy Carter have all supported the need for this research to continue. So you're joining an esteemed list of people.
Okay, so Christopher Reeve presents this in a way that I suspect is familiar to most of us. First, he provides us with this long list or elenchum of different diseases that he hopes, perhaps, possibly, someday, may be able to be treated if we choose to go down this research avenue. And then you notice he also mentions the various Washington insider types and the various Hollywood personalities rapidly lining up in support of this approach to regenerative medicine. Now, if we just kind of hit the pause button for a second and say, well, what's the argument here? What's the justification that's put forward for doing this? And there's really largely a single argument that you encounter for the most part, and I call this the benefit argument. And this is presented by Dr. Thomas Okarma. He was the president of Geron Corporation, which is one of these biotech companies that's actively looking at, or was actively looking at, developing human embryonic stem cell therapies. Dr. Okarma and I had the chance to debate each other in a panel setting a few years ago at a meeting of the American Chemical Society in San Francisco. It was a very interesting debate, and again, he trotted out this same benefit argument. And what is this argument? How is it typically laid out for us? Well, he says, we believe that not to develop the technology would do great harm to over 100 million patients in the United States alone who are affected by diseases potentially treatable by the many medical applications of human embryonic stem cells. So notice here, 100 million patients. Sometimes they'll say 120 million patients. This number is not in any way corroborated by the current state of the science. In fact, if you actually track down the origin of this number, it's simply adding up the total number of sick people who happen to be around, believe it or not. He answers the phone, the doc answers the phone, take 2 stem cells and call me in the morning. You know, everybody's hoping that regenerative medicine one day may end up being this simple and this powerful. But again, a cartoon like this sounds the same cautionary note that we've got to discriminate the truth from all the hype that is out there. Let me share with you 3 of these media myths that I think are pretty big ones, pretty commonly held misperceptions. The first one would be that stem cells come only from embryos. Everybody talks about the stem cells from embryos. They're the glamorous ones. They're the exciting ones. They're the ones that get all the press time, if you will. As if there were no other contenders on the field. As if there were no other participants in the discussion. But in point of fact, stem cells come from many sources besides embryos. And I'm going to just review with you what some of those other sources are. And I'm pretty sure that I'm going to mention some sources that you guys may not have ever heard of before. So, let's look at another type of stem cell. I've mentioned the ones from embryos, the tiny little 5-day-old embryos. Turns out you can also get them from slightly older humans who are fetuses. And these would typically be obtained after a direct abortion. And what you do is you remove a particular cluster of cells from the aborted fetus and grow it as a cell line. So that's shown here. You have a 5 to 9 week old fetus, and you extract the cells from these genital ridges of the corpse of the child, and these cells are then plated into a petri dish, once again to establish a stem cell line. Now, the researcher who discovered these cells, Dr. John Gearhart, he and I have kind of crossed swords on different occasions. You know, I've had various opportunities to give testimony at state legislative hearings, and sometimes Dr. Gearhart has shown up at these same hearings and argued in favor of these morally problematic approaches to research. And I also had the chance to debate him one time on National Public Radio. You know, I remember one occasion where I went to a scientific meeting at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and it was a meeting on stem cells, and you know, it was a meeting of all scientists, and as you can imagine, it sometimes causes a bit of a stir when somebody dressed like this walks into the middle of a scientific meeting like that. And Dr. Gearhart was presenting at this meeting, and during the break, I went up to him and I said, well, you know, John, these are interesting cells that you've discovered. Can you tell me how you actually get a hold of them? And he said, well, it's actually very simple. I just ask one of my graduate students to go over to the abortion clinic, and they wait in the lobby, and then they get fresh material from which these cells can be rapidly dissected or removed. So, you know, a reminder to us of some of these problematic collaborations with evil, which can begin to occur when certain research directions may be uncritically embraced by scientists. All right, so 2 sources so far, right? Tiny little embryos who are 5 days or so of age, and slightly older humans, 5 to 9 weeks of age. Where else can you get stem cells from? Well, it turns out you can get them from our own adult bodies and from pregnancy-related tissues. So I suspect that most of you have heard of the umbilical cord stem cells. When you have a baby, you have the option of paying, I think it's about $1,500, and there are companies that will take the umbilical cord after the baby is delivered, remove the blood, and then they get the stem cells. Then they take those stem cells and freeze them and store them in case your baby gets sick with certain kinds of blood diseases later on. Then you can thaw out the cells and use them to treat the child. Sometimes you can also use those cells to treat a closely related family member, you know, who would be a good match, immune match to the baby. In addition, placentas and amniotic fluid, the fluid that the baby swims around in, are also enriched sources of adult-type stem cells. Our own bodies as adults also contain significant pools or reservoirs of stem cells, especially bone marrow. Turns out that your bone marrow has very high titers of adult stem cells. And I'm going to show you some examples of what can be done with these cells a little bit later on. You've all heard of a bone marrow transplant, right? Of course. I mean, bone marrow transplants, the reason they are effective is because the active ingredient in the bone marrow is the stem cell. Anybody remember or know what year the first human bone marrow transplant took place? I thought, when I looked this up, I thought it was in the 1980s. But you know when it actually was? It was 1958. More than a half century ago. Now, why do I mention that? Because this gives us a sense of perspective. We have been using adult stem cells in the clinic to treat sick people for more than 50 years already. But that never makes it into the news or the headlines. People just beat the drum and raise the clamor about destroying embryos. So we're going to see that this is an issue of concern as we discuss the ethics. Fat from liposuction, believe it or not, this contains significant amounts of adult stem cells. And of course, we have no shortage of this available in our country, if we want to make use of it. I know a researcher who focuses just on these cells derived from fat. And it's a whole kind of international community of researchers who collaborate on this. Nasal epithelium. Let me just mention what this is. If you take a very sharp instrument and punch way up inside your nose, far enough that you contact some of those fibers from the olfactory bulb, which is the part of your brain that helps you to smell, if you extract those cells, turns out that they contain neural stem cells and these OEGs. These OEGs, for those of you who may not have heard of these are olfactory and sheathing glia. These are cells that put myelin coatings onto nerves. Because as you remember, there's an electrical signal that goes through nerves, and the olfactory and sheathing glia provide a kind of insulation, like the insulation on the wires of your house, so that the signal can be conducted through your neurons. So this mixture of cells that you get from inside your nose turns out to be useful for treating people like Christopher Reeve, who have spinal cord injury. Finally, cadavers, dead people. Up to 20 hours after somebody dies, you can go into their brain and extract particular nuclei that will be enriched for adult neural stem cells. So, look at this slide overall. What's the take-home message here? It's pretty simple. There are many sources of stem cells besides embryos. But again, if you just get your information from the NBC Nightly News, or other major media outlets, many Americans are hardly aware of this important consideration. All right, we've got a cartoon here. You notice he's holding the Petri dish, and it's got stem cells, and he says, with stem cells, we can grow just about anything. He's, of course, referring to their tremendous flexibility. But what does he end up growing here? A kind of ugly-looking ethical dilemma. And you notice that the cartoonist drew this so that it looks like a tumor. And there's a good reason for that, because it turns out that when you introduce embryonic stem cells into animals, maybe you're trying to treat a rat for a particular disease, and you introduce these stem cells, if they're undifferentiated, they can often turn into a type of tumor that can grow very large and even kill the very animal that you're trying to cure. So this has been a problem and a concern, that these embryonic stem cells from embryos are so energetic. Remember what they're doing. They're there in that early small embryo, developing, new tissues and organs, liver, kidney, brain, all the incredible cells that make us up. And those cells, if you take them out of the embryo and put them in another setting, very hard to control, and they behave aberrantly. So this has been a continuing concern when people say, can we use them for a therapy someday? Well, there's always this risk of tumor formation. All right, myth number 2, another big one. I run into this a lot. The Catholic Church is against stem cell research. I'm sure many of you have heard some kind of statement like this. And of course, this is a myth. The truth of the matter is very different. And I want to look at this. I mean, I remember one time, I travel a lot and speak on this issue. I was in Los Angeles, and the taxi cab driver was driving me to the place where I was going to be speaking, and he said, hey, Padre, why are you here? What's going on? I said, I'm giving a talk on stem cells. And, he had a nice image of Our Lady of Guadalupe hanging from the mirror in the car. And his first reaction was, we're opposed to all that, right, Padre? I think people have this idea that the church is just about no, no, no. But I want to emphasize to you that in this discussion, the church is very much about yes. When you look at the stem cell pie, most of that pie is ethical. It's only a tiny little sliver of that pie that raises moral concerns. Precisely that sliver that gets all the attention. So let's look at this by doing an overview of the ethics and recognizing that the ethical concerns differ with the source of the cells. Where you get them from is critical. So let's look at our super categories. We have the embryonic stem cells, which we said come from embryos, exactly. Now, is it ever going to be morally acceptable to use these cells? Well, it isn't, because if you're talking about human embryonic stem cells, you must necessarily destroy, or as the scientist prefers to say, disaggregate young humans in order to get these cells. So this is inherently an exploitative form of medical research, and one that should not be pursued in scientific settings. So it is true that the Roman Catholic Church, for one, and most Christians, and most men of goodwill, I would suggest to you, will stand in opposition to this directly exploitative form of biomedical research. What about the germ cells, embryonic germ cells? Do you remember where those come from? Fetuses, right. And so let me ask, is there ever going to be a morally acceptable way that you could use these cells? Anybody have an idea? Embryonic germ cells, yes. From a miscarriage, very good, that's correct. Because remember, a miscarriage happens naturally. The mother loses her child, and she and her husband could give permission to use the cells from the deceased child's body, just like they could give permission for an organ donation, right? No moral or ethical problems there. So there is a way to do germ cell research that does not cross fundamental ethical lines. Of course, using these cells from a direct abortion is a whole nother matter. What about umbilical cord stem cells? Are there any fundamental moral objections here? No, this doesn't raise any problems. What about the adult stem cells from our own bodies? Are there any moral objections to using these cells? No, there wouldn't be. Again, as long as you get consent of, whoever you did the liposuction on, for example. So notice here, we have 4 categories of stem cells, 3 out of 4 of which the Roman Catholic Church, and again, most Christians and most men of goodwill, would have no ethical qualms with. So, take-home message, most forms of stem cell research are ethical. I want to expand on this idea a little further with you. And just mention a few other categories. A number of years ago, I was approached by some scientists at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. They were putting together a book. They wanted me to write a chapter. So I agreed to do this. They wanted me to write on the Catholic Church and stem cells. So as I sat down to draft this chapter, the first thing that I did was I put together a kind of master list of all the different flavors or varieties of stem cell research that I could think of. And this is the list that I came up with. Don't worry, we're not going to go through all 10 of them. But the point that I made in that article, and the point that I would like to share with you this morning, you notice there are 10 entries. Of the 10 entries there, the Roman Catholic Church could support 9 out of 10 of those forms of stem cell research. It is only number 1, pluripotent stem cells derived from human embryos, that raises intractable moral objections. Now, I do want to mention 2 others on this list because they have been in the news in the past few years in kind of a big way. Number 6 and number 9. Let's jump to number 6 right away. Germ cells from adults. Now, wait a minute. We already said germ cells usually come from aborted fetuses, right? Well, that's true, but it turns out there's another way that you can get a hold of these cells from an adult. And what this involves, this was done originally in Germany using mice, using male mice. And what they did was they were able to extract from the testicles of these mice the cells that are responsible for making sperm. And they were able to grow these cells as a cell line. And they exhibit the same kind of flexibility as the ones that you get out of either aborted fetuses or embryos. So this was published a number of years ago, and then shortly afterwards, a startup company in California announced that they could do the same thing using male cadavers. They could remove these cells shortly after a man had died and culture them as a stem cell line. So notice, no embryos are involved here. And the idea would be that a man could submit himself for a biopsy, give his own sample of tissue, you could turn it into a particular cell lineage, put it back into the man, maybe into his heart, and it wouldn't be rejected, right? Because it's his own cells. For a long time, this was only available to men. In women, they identified these same cells on women's ovaries, so they are also available now for women. Number 9 on that list is an even bigger breakthrough. This is the idea that you could take plain old, boring, garden variety skin cells, put them into a petri dish, force some genes inside those cells, and reprogram them so you kind of push the clock backwards, and these cells turn into, believe it or not, embryonic type stem cells without ever touching a human embryo, using your own cells. Now, nobody really believed that this was possible for a long period of time, but a Japanese researcher made the breakthrough a few years ago, and he won the Nobel Prize in science for this. So an incredible paradigm-shifting kind of a development. So again, you force genes into these cells, and the way you do it is you use typically viruses that will inject the genes inside the cells. So the basic idea here, you have a fibroblast, which is just the fancy word for a skin cell, and these are the genetic factors that are forced inside the cell, which then cause it to transmute into an embryonic stem cell-like cell. We call these iPS cells, or induced pluripotent. Now, what is pluripotency? That's that flexibility that we were talking about, that embryonic stem cells have. The ability to make any, at least in theory, any of the 220 cell types in my body or yours. So, this is an alternative way to get the same flexibility. This, as I mentioned, changed the debate profoundly, and everybody recognized the significance of this breakthrough. What I have here is a video clip from the day that this discovery was announced. This is from the evening newscast, and you'll see that they discuss how this affects not only the scientific, but the ethical debate. And you'll notice also that the National Catholic Bioethics Center, where I work, is referenced here.
Scientists studying human stem cells today announced findings that could revolutionize medical research and perhaps someday the way diseases are treated. Researchers say they found a way to reprogram human skin cells and give them the awesome potential of embryonic stem cells. As ABC's David Muir reports, the advance has not only medical implications, but ethical and political ones as well.
Stem cell researchers rarely use the word breakthrough, but they did so today.
These scientists achieved really finding the holy grail of the stem cell field.
Researchers took skin cells and injected them with a virus. That virus prompted the skin cells to reprogram themselves, turning back the clock and essentially turning them into cells that mirror embryonic stem cells.
These scientists have allowed the skin cells to take on the chameleon-like properties of embryonic stem cells. They now can make any tissue in the body.
It offers brand new hope for patients with so many diseases, including Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. But scientists caution it could take years to find a safe way to put those new cells back into the body. Already, longtime opponents of embryonic stem cell research say this new breakthrough should halt all use of human embryos. Today, the Conservative Family Research Council said this alternative demonstrates what pro-lifers have been saying since the beginning. And the National Catholic Bioethics Center agrees.
It is a breakthrough certainly on the moral and ethical front, in the sense that it gives us a new way to go forward without having to make use of human embryos.
But the debate is far from over. Today, Michael J. Fox's foundation, though hopeful about the breakthrough, said at this time embryonic stem cells remain the gold standard for understanding how a cell develops and, in particular, how they convert into other cell types.
One new path but don't abandon all the other paths that are possible.
Few, if any, argue the scope of today's breakthrough, but the discovery will surely not end the debate. David Muir, ABC News, New York.
All right, so this incredible breakthrough that I mentioned was achieved by a Japanese scientist, Dr. Shinya Yamanaka. He's shown here. He's the fellow who received the Nobel Prize. Very interesting. Dr. Yamanaka, as far as I know, is not a man of any particular religious persuasion. He's one of these, hard-working bench scientists, one of these guys who lives in the lab 24/7, working really hard. I sometimes call them monks for science, that type of personality. And nonetheless, when he was interviewed by the New York Times about this breakthrough, he made some very perceptive and very helpful comments about the ethics. Comments that remind us that these basic moral issues that we're talking about can be known by people of any religious persuasion or even of no particular religious persuasion. Because what we're talking about here at the root level is an issue of basic human rights. So what was it that Dr. Yamanaka said that was so clear and enlightening here to the New York Times? He memorably described the ethical quandary after visiting a friend who worked at a fertility clinic. After looking down the microscope at one of the human embryos stored at the clinic, he later reflected back on the moment. When I saw the embryo, I suddenly realized there was such a small difference between it and my daughters, said Dr. Yamanaka, 45, a father of two, and now a professor at the Institute for Integrated Cell Material Sciences at Kyoto University. I thought, we can't keep destroying embryos for our research. There must be another way. And he has pioneered this new way that has significantly altered the trajectory of this national and international discussion. George Daly, a researcher who we heard from just in that video a moment ago at Harvard, he acknowledged this. He said, as soon as you have a cell type that is relatively free of this black cloud, meaning the black ethical cloud, then obviously there's huge pent-up interest. And Dr. Jamie Thompson, who we saw on the cover of Time magazine, people are jumping in very rapidly, much more rapidly than they did 10 years ago when he first obtained stem cells by destroying human embryos. So a very exciting, very promising development. Literally hundreds of laboratories are now working with the IPS, induced pluripotent stem cells. In addition to these kinds of remarkable breakthroughs, we have further breakthroughs occurring in terms of therapies for very sick patients. And these therapies are coming from adult and umbilical cord stem cells. So I want to give you some real-life examples, some true stories that are really amazing here. The first one involves this woman. Her name is Patricia Durante. And she has an interesting story. When she was 21 years old, she was pregnant with her daughter, and they discovered, unfortunately, that she had leukemia. And she had a very aggressive kind of leukemia. They said to her, we're sorry to tell you this, but you're only going to live about another 6 months or so. This kind of leukemia is one of the worst. However, what they said they were going to do is they said, we'll go ahead and deliver your daughter early by a C-section, and then we're going to hit you hard with chemo. And hopefully, God willing, that will cure your cancer. Well, they tried it, but it did not work. The cancer came back full force, and they realized, we're running out of time here. However, they had saved her daughter's umbilical cord stem cells, and they decided to take those cells. Turned out that she and her daughter were a good match. That's not always true. A mother doesn't always match her own baby, but in this case she did. And they were able to take those cells and perfuse them into Patricia's body after they destroyed her own immune and blood system and set up a brand new blood system that made her leukemia-free. So this was a remarkable development And she was interviewed on Canadian television about this after it happened. This shows the interview, and Dr. Laneville, Dr. Pierre Laneville, is the physician who carried out this procedure, and I'm quite sure that this was the first time in history that a mother had ever been cured using her own daughter's umbilical cord stem cells.
Montreal mother is alive today thanks to her baby. 6 months into her pregnancy, Patricia Durante was told she had leukemia and that she'd die without a bone marrow transplant. Well, she got that transplant using blood cells from her baby's umbilical cord. It's believed to be a medical first. Patricia Durante and the blood specialist who treated her, Dr. Pierre Laneville, are both in Montreal. No, so, Patricia, how do you feel? I mean, it seems to have worked. The cancer is in remission thanks to your daughter. How do you feel about that?
I feel better than ever. I feel very fortunate to be able to spend the rest of my life with my daughter, thanks to Dr. Laneville.
How are you feeling today? We can hear
great.
Angel in the back. I take it that's Angel, right?
Yes. Would you like to see her?
Yeah.
Say hi. Say hi. Say I'm Angel. I'm Victoria.
Can I ask why you called her Angel? I think I know the answer.
Well, pretty much because if I wouldn't have been pregnant, I would never have found out that I had leukemia, and thank God we were able to save her umbilical cord. That saved my life. So I gave life to her, and she gave mine back.
It's great to hear your story. Thanks for coming in this morning.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, Angel.
So a remarkable story. I love it when she says, I gave life to my daughter, and she gave life back to me. One of these, real life instances of stem cells today healing people. I want to mention another area that rapid progress is being made, and this is for treating heart damage. You can have situations like a heart attack where some of the muscle in your heart dies and the function of the heart is impaired. You can also have something called congestive heart failure, which is a more globalized kind of a phenomenon. But they are finding that the use of adult stem cells from the bone marrow is opening up some new treatment modalities here. And it's really quite remarkable, some of the pilot studies, what they have seen here. The basic procedure is you remove bone marrow stem cells. Now, this shows using a big needle. My uncle had this procedure, and he said, this is not actually very pleasant because they put a very large needle right into the back and go into this bone and extract the bone marrow stem cells. But it's turning out that you don't have to even do it that way. You can actually hook a person up with an IV, remove their own blood, filter the blood, and get stem cells that way, so it's a little bit less invasive. But anyway, you got to get a fair amount of these bone marrow stem cells. Then you take them and you introduce them into the damaged heart muscle. And this triggers a number of mechanisms that then result in scar repair. And in some cases, it's really quite dramatic. I have a video clip here that I'm going to show you from Germany. This was the original pilot study, and this was done a number of years ago. And it demonstrated that the heart and the way it beats actually improves. Watch on this video in particular the angiograms of the beating heart, and you'll be able to see before, when they had the heart attack, and after, when the stem cell treatment was used, how much improvement there is in the way that the heart contracts.
Cardiology professor Andreas Zeyer is running an experimental trial for severe heart attack victims. He hopes to repair patients' hearts by using their own stem cells, stopping their slide into disability and avoiding the need for high-cost medical care.
What happens during a heart attack is that the cells die within an hour, hour and a half after being deprived from oxygen. And this finally results in scar formation of the heart. That means those dead cells are like a scar on your skin. They do not contract. They do not contribute to the pump function of the heart.
The pilot study for this therapy, published in December 2002, involved 20 patients. They all showed an improvement in heart pumping capacity 3 times greater than that from standard treatments.
What we can do is we can measure how the heart squeezes the blood. Every single patient in the pilot study had an improvement in how that pumping occurred.
Wolf Makowitz is a 40-year-old patient from the original pilot study. He had a massive heart attack in September 2002 and was briefly on the heart transplant waiting list. Instead, he received the stem cell transplant and is now at the hospital to find out how his heart has healed.
I can just show you what this therapy actually does. This angiogram simply shows the pumping function of the heart. This was before treatment, and I think it's very obvious. In this area here, the heart is perfectly contracting, as we say, so it's moving inward, and therefore blood is propelled outward. But in this area over here, there's almost no movement inward, so no pump function at all. And this is the scar damage of the heart attack, which does not pump anymore and thereby does not contribute to the expulsion of blood into the body. And this is what we find after 4 months. And now you see that the scar area is almost completely gone. You see a perfect inward movement of the heart over here, and therefore the expulsion of blood is much better. This we would regard as a completely normal function of the heart. Okay. So there is no residual state after the heart attack.
And it would require very little expense, very little organization to get it into mainstream clinical practice. And it will have a major effect on millions and millions of people around the world.
300 heart attack patients have now been treated with their own bone marrow stem cells. The oldest was 84.
So hopefully you were able to see that improvement before and after. And this mentioned 300. Actually, the number of patients who have been treated is now much more because this was from a number of years ago. So, having looked at some of those examples, we hearken then to the third myth, which is that embryo stem cell research has shown the most promise in developing treatments and cures. That's what the hype tries to make us believe. The fact here is that adult stem cell research is already curing numerous humans. And, as a reminder of this, I want to flash up one of these classic lists of different diseases that can be treated using adult or umbilical cord stem cells. So you see there's lots of different leukemias here. You notice there are various anemias over here. Goes on to a second page. You have things like Hodgkin's disease. Here's neuroblastoma at the bottom. That's a type of, it's something like a brain cancer that can often be treated quite effectively using adult stem cells. And then on the right, various other syndromes and diseases. Here's one called Krabbe disease. Krabbe leukodystrophy. Put up your hand. Has anybody ever heard of Krabbe disease? I didn't think so. It's really super rare. 1 out of 100,000 babies that are born have this disease, and it's an enzyme problem. They're missing an enzyme. And what happens is they always die by around age 2 because they don't have this critical enzyme. But if you can find a matched donor for an umbilical cord sample and you transplant the umbilical cord stem cells into that baby, those umbilical cord stem cells make the missing enzyme and the baby can grow and thrive. This is a picture of a little girl with this disease. Her name is Gina Rugari. She had a little brother who was born with this before her. And as I said, it's a really rare disease. And he started to get sick. And then he got sicker. And they weren't sure what was going on. And then he eventually died. And after he died, they sort of put the pieces of the puzzle together. And they said, well, maybe it was Krabbe's that he had. And indeed it was. So when Gina was born, they tested her right away, determined that she did have the disease. They rushed her to a specialist at Duke University Medical Center and did a transplant of the umbilical cord stem cells. And she is now growing and thriving. It was interesting. One time I was speaking down in Louisville, Kentucky, and I had maybe 300 people in the room, and the seats were lined up kind of in straight rows, pretty similar to the way it is here. There was a woman sitting in the front row, and as I was speaking, she was kind of just fixed intently on everything I was saying. And after I finished the talk, she jumped up out of her chair, she came over to me and she said, "Father Tad, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Gina's mom." And she said, "Thank you for showing her picture and describing what these stem cells can do for people who are facing serious illnesses." So she was very excited to see that. And then she emailed me afterwards a picture. This is Gina in the middle, now at that point when she sent it to me, which was a few years ago, in kindergarten. And they were worried because if you don't do these transplants early enough, there's a chance that the child will have some mental deficiencies and, intelligence problems. But they've tested Gina, and thanks be to God, she tests right at her grade level. So she is doing really well. Back to our list, page 3, you have various red cell diseases. Down at the bottom, severe combined immunodeficiency. You've probably all heard of that. It's the bubble boy syndrome, when you're born with no immune system at all. And you can use either umbilical cord or bone marrow stem cells to treat those kids. And then various T and B cell disorders are shown on the right. So this is a long and impressive list. This list is not even current. It's from a few years ago. I haven't updated it lately. But it seems that, every few months or so, there may be a new disease that gets added to the list. People talk about embryos as if cures are occurring everywhere. And this is a fiction. So I think at least, full disclosure and honesty up front is important in these discussions. We need to have our facts clearly presented to the American public as they discuss these important, vital moral questions. Now, I want to make a quick point here. I always stress to people, look, if you throw enough million or billions of dollars at any difficult problem, and you have enough graduate student man-hours of slave labor invested into this, I was a graduate student once, so I know how it goes, you can solve these kinds of problems. And so it's very possible that someday in the future, we will wake up and we will see a New York Times banner headline that says, "Embryos cure Parkinson's," or "Embryos cure diabetes." And then we're going to have a real moral dilemma on our hands. And we don't want to see our society go down a path that is exploitative, especially when we realize the remarkable power of all the alternatives. So important that you and all of us be well informed around this critical discussion. All right, so I want to slowly wrap things up here by focusing on respect for the human embryo. This is where the rubber meets the road. When we see a picture like this is a tiny little embryo on the point of a sewing pin. People will say, "Oh, that embryo, it's so small, it's so tiny. That embryo doesn't have hands, doesn't have feet, doesn't have eyes, doesn't have a face for me to look into, doesn't even have a brain yet. How can you seriously expect me to treat something that tiny the same way that I treat an adult who's walking around, especially if that adult has some terrible disease or ailment that might perhaps possibly someday be able to be treated if I choose to go after that little embryo today? Oh, they're so tiny. Come on." That's how the argument goes. So when we see a picture like this is actually an amazing picture. It's a scanning electron micrograph of an 8-cell human embryo sitting on the point of a sewing pin. This embryo is so small that you can actually see the irregularities in the metal of the sewing pin here. And again, people say, "Oh, it's so small." Well, it's true, but the question we need to ask here is not whether or not the embryo is small, but rather a different question. we need to ask, isn't this exactly what a young human is supposed to look like? And notice, that affirmation does not depend on religion, does not depend on value systems, does not depend on imposing anything on anyone. It just depends on properly understanding our biology 101 and our own embryonic origins. But, this is difficult for people to grasp. I mean, I sometimes will say to people, as a former embryo myself, I have strong opinions about how embryos should be treated. I think our challenge is to reconnect with our own humble origins. As I say, this is difficult for people to do, and it can be very difficult for politicians to do, for lawmakers. They oftentimes don't see this. They have a funny, strange hierarchy of goods, where the supreme good in their hierarchy sometimes, I'm afraid to say, is the good of re-election. And that trumps, all kinds of other critical considerations. I speak to lawmakers quite a bit in the work that I do. And I want to share with you an example that I use with lawmakers sometimes. And a number of them have told me afterwards that they found this to be very helpful. This example involves the American bald eagle. I've given talks over the years in many places, including in Canada. And I don't know if you guys have had the chance to see American bald eagles out in the wild. They're very impressive birds. They're huge birds. I remember being in Canada, they go up there to go after the salmon and to lay eggs and so on, and seeing them at the top of the trees. They're huge and impressive birds. And to see them in the wild is truly, truly an incredible experience. And these birds were on the endangered species list. Do you remember that? A few years back. And there was concern that these birds might become extinct. Let's just watch this final catch here. It's how's that for some serious hand-to-eye coordination? Pretty amazing. So these birds, were in danger of going extinct. And what did we do in this country? We did something very important. We passed a federal law to protect these birds. And it's interesting because if you read through the text of that federal law, what it says is basically if you're out there in the wilderness walking around with your shotgun over your shoulder, and you see one of these birds in the sky overhead, and you take your shotgun and you shoot the bird out of the air, you will suffer very stiff legal penalties, X, Y, Z. But also, in the same law, you keep on reading, it points out that if you're walking out in the wilderness and you come across the nest of a bald eagle, and you see eggs in that nest, and you destroy one egg, guess what? You suffer exactly the same legal penalties, X, Y, and Z, as if you had shot the bird out of the air. Now, that makes sense, right? I mean, if these birds are valuable, you're going to protect them at all stages of their life cycle, from very beginning to very end. Why? What is it that's so special about that egg? What's actually inside that egg? It is an embryonic eagle. The very same creature that flies gloriously in the clouds overhead. And even a perfect and resolute atheist can appreciate the reasonableness and cogency of a federal law like that seeks to protect the animal at all stages of its life cycle. And yet, strangely, the moment we begin to talk about our own very humble embryonic origins, we go through all kinds of mental conniptions and somersaults trying to tell ourselves that we weren't really embryos or whatever the false argument is, trying our darndest to justify the unjustifiable. All right, we have the scientist here. He's holding the Petri dish with the embryo, and he says, harvesting stem cells from human embryos, like the one in this petri dish, will save lives. And this little guy says, not mine. That's what the ethical controversy is swirling around, and very legitimately so. All right, so I'd like to share with you my final slide, and then we're going to have an opportunity for some questions. It's a beautiful picture, and I'd like to tell you the story of the lady who took this picture. Interestingly, what she did, she ran an advertisement in the newspaper, and she asked for men who had large hands to please contact her. So men were taking their hands, putting them down on a sheet of paper, tracing the outline of their fingers, and then faxing her these sheets of paper. And she went through them all, and she eventually chose this guy, who I believe was a taxi cab driver in New York City. And he came in and he held this beautiful little boy. Now, this little boy was somewhat premature when he was born, so he was kind of already small. And she took this amazing picture. And I like it so much because it's really a simple reminder to us of how human life has been entrusted into our hands. And that life is by nature weak, defenseless, vulnerable, not able to speak on its own behalf. So it becomes incumbent upon the rest of us who have been so blessed and privileged to have, as it were, passed through those early and vulnerable stages, for us to turn around and look back so that we can become the voice of those who have no voice of their own, so that we can speak out on their behalf for their protection. And I'll close that the true measure of the greatness of a society will not be in terms of its gross national product, will not be in terms of its military power. The true measure of the greatness of a society will always be in terms of how it treats its weakest members. All right, so thank you very much. Tremendous pleasure to be with you. Well, thank you so much. So any questions that people have, feel free. Give you a minute here to kind of think, and hopefully some of you would like to raise some questions.
Okay, my first question was concerning neurons. You said that we were able to improve it, but we haven't had a complete connection. How are we able to create skin cells? We're able to put those back on, and that's an organ itself, and recreate the skin, but we can't completely do that with the neurons.
Yeah, okay, you're sort of asking about spinal cord injury, right? When you break your spinal cord, it's really hard to get new connections to go across the break. That's kind of what you're wondering about? Yeah, that's a great question, because this has been, a huge problem for people who are in wheelchairs. It's how do we really assist them? And is there any way, when you have a serious break in the spinal cord, to have growth occur across that space? So, you remember I mentioned the olfactory and sheathing glia. Those are the ones that put the myelin coats on, but it turns out that mixture of cells actually helps with a certain amount of process growth out of neurons. And if you can also get coverings placed onto the nerves, it appears it may be possible, also, depending on added chemical factors and so on being present, to be able to have those neurons cross a space of breakage and reestablish a valid connection. But as you can imagine, this is an area that's really actively being pursued by researchers. And it's a complex area, so you're right to ask the question, because they've tried a number of things that have not worked. And I would say that this whole area of endeavor is currently in its infancy, at its beginning.
Then I have one more question.
Sure.
Was concerning the, if we're able to, we don't approve of, as Catholics, we do not approve of, cloning animals, per se, do we?
Okay, of cloning.
In general, yeah.
Of cloning animals.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, let's talk a little bit just quickly, generally, about the ethics of cloning. Cloning of animals like Dolly the sheep is one thing. Cloning of humans raises a whole nother range of questions. And your question is specifically about animals. So, for example, maybe you would have a situation where you have created a special type of cow, where when that cow produces milk, there are special antibodies inside that milk that can be purified and used, let's say, to treat a cancer patient. And maybe you only have one cow like this, and you want to clone that cow so you have 2 or 3 of them all producing this vital antibody to treat the cancer patients. That would be a good argument for cloning that cow so that you would be able to benefit the patients. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with cloning animals if there's a proportionate reason for doing so. Human beings, it's an entirely different matter, because our own individuality here is threatened on several levels. We're turning the creation of young humans into a laboratory adventure rather than us being born through the embrace, the loving embrace of our parents. Because we're all meant to be loved into being, not created as objects in test tubes or petri dishes. It depersonalizes us, it treats us as lesser than we are if we go that path. So cloning partakes of that. There's also the problem that you ask, why would you clone another human? You're saying to yourself, well, I want to determine who this new person's going to be, and I want to copy someone else who's already out there. Maybe, some Hollywood superstar. I'm going to clone the Hollywood superstar because I want to have a baby that's just like him. This becomes a kind of selfish seeking to control the fate and the identity of others. Rather, the way the Lord God has set up human sexuality, there's a kind of randomness. Each of us, it gets kind of half of our characteristics from our mom, half from our dad. There's a beautiful mix there, and we have a new individuality that is our own. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Great questions. Yes?
Can stealth stem cells cure autism and brain injuries like concussions?
Okay, can stem cells help brain injuries and concussions? Is that your question?
Yes.
That is another good question. I don't know the current state of research on that. What I can tell you is that there are researchers looking at things like stroke, which is a different kind of brain injury, and there are people looking at Parkinson's, which is a focal damage in part of the brain where one of the nuclei, called the substantia nigra, degenerates. So damage from concussions and so on, I don't see in principle why it wouldn't be possible in the future to generate therapies that would help people. I just don't know off the top of my head the current state of that research. Do you have another question?
Could you treat people with brain defects like autism and retardation, like with their brain being messed up? Could you assist situations like autism? Autism is a very complicated type of a disease. We're not sure of what is causing it. So at this stage of the game, I have not heard many people suggest that stem cells might work in the future, but it's early in the game, and there's a lot of research, good research that's being done on autism, and my hope is that eventually maybe it would be possible to assist people with the use of some of these stem cell therapies. Thank you. Yes?
Earlier in the presentation, you talked about cancer and the risk of cancer when using embryonic stem cells. Does that risk go down, or what is that risk when using germ cells or iPS cells?
Great question. Yes. You're right that when you use stem cells out of embryos, there's a known tumorigenic risk. What about those other ones that are so similar to the ones from embryos, the iPS cells, which are the ones that we put the genes into the skin cell, or the germ cells, which are the ones from the aborted fetuses typically? Well, it turns out because those cells, both of those other cell types, are pluripotent, which means they're, the most flexible variety, there's the same problem. There's the same risk of tumors. So, the big picture here is we have to figure out how to use embryonic type stem cells, meaning, ethical ones like iPS or germ cells from miscarriages. We have to figure out how to use those in a way that we step away from the tumor risk. And one proposal that people make is, well, we could take the stem cell over here, convert it into the desired cell, let's say a heart cell, and get, 2 million heart cells and put them into us, and be sure that in those 2 million heart cells, there aren't any undifferentiated embryonic stem cells. Because if you have that contamination, even a small number, then you might get the cancer, you might get the tumor. And that's the tricky part, technically. How do you prepare 2 million cells or 10 million cells without having, 5 or 6 of the other ones contaminating it? But scientists are working on that. They have some great cell sorting technologies that's moving forward very quickly. So, again, great question. Thank you. You have another one?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
So you talked about embryonic stem cells being pluripotent, which means they can transform into most types of tissues. But what about totipotent cells that can transform into all of them? Is there ever a chance that science is going to want to use that type of cell?
A totipotent cell, just so that everybody's clear on this, is what an embryo is. If you have a one-cell embryo, you remember that's called a zygote, right? That cell is totipotent, which means it's an organism, which means it makes all the cell types of your body plus all the cell types of the placenta. And those cells at that early stage are organisms of the species. So each of us was once a single-cell, totipotent cell. And now your question is, are researchers ever going to want to use a cell like that and study it and so on? And I'm afraid that they may want to. It's going to depend on where we draw our ethical lines. In other words, if we're here very firm and very strong and say, look, we only want ethical science, we don't want to have the destruction of embryos occurring, we're going to draw the line in the sand so that you can't ever touch an embryo, we're only going to do, research that relies on alternatives, then I think the clamoring for embryos is likely to decline. But scientifically, embryos are interesting. I mean, it's an amazing thing when you think of one cell that each of us once was, and you end up with you and me, each of us have 220 cell types in our body, and they're intercommunicating and, passing blood around and nutrients and oxygen and all these other things. And you just say to yourself, how does all of this occur? It is remarkable. So to understand the programmed development, that's one of the reasons they would like to study embryos. Now, I always emphasize it doesn't have to be human embryos. We can study monkey embryos. Monkeys are very similar to us in many ways, and we can understand those developmental questions without doing anything that's unethical. So I hope that's helpful. Thank you. Yes, yeah, great questions.
So you talked about embryonic stem cells and then aborted fetus stem cells and then adult stem cells, but what about the in-between? Like maybe you could, from a healthy baby that's up to 2 years old, store their stem cells for when they're older, or kids our age could we donate blood, why not?
Yes,
donate
in other words,
cells?
could we bank our own cells and sort of become donors for ourselves? And yes, that's definitely a possibility. The numbers that you get tend to be smaller when you do that than from, say, umbilical cord. So let me just say, umbilical cord banking, great idea. I mean, look, women who have babies, after the pregnancy is done, what happens to the umbilical cord normally? It gets thrown away, right? I mean, you don't use it normally. So why don't we go ahead and bank all of these? And it's very interesting because if you store a lot of umbilical cords, meaning, a few thousand, you will end up having a profile of immune haplotypes that will cover for most of the population. So, for most of you who are in this room, if we banked a few thousand, we would most likely be able to find a match. And the bigger the pool that you bank, the more likely it is that you will find a successful match. So that's something that should be very much encouraged. Certain states provide money to hospitals so that when women deliver their babies, they will then, save the stem cells from the umbilical cord. So the other part of your question about later on, let's say myself donating my own, doing a kind of pheresis where I would, have a IV put in, take out my blood, and they filter it and get the stem cells. I could do that, but the numbers will tend to be smaller. It's a longer process to do that. But in certain clinical situations, it can be useful. And as you know, sometimes when people go in for a surgery, a particular surgery, before they have surgery, if it's a known surgery, they will just do a regular blood donation of their own, a few months before, so that if they have a crisis, they don't have to use someone else's blood. They can use their own. So those same types of approaches could be easily deployed for stem cells. Thank you. Yes.
I just have a question, not about embryonic stem cells, but for other stem cells. What are the major risks, or do they have negative outcomes when you try to use them?
Okay, that's a very good question as well, because there are risks. We have to be honest here. You saw the woman who I mentioned with leukemia, right? There were risks for her in what she did in using her daughter's umbilical cord stem cells. One risk is that she and her daughter were not perfect match. They were a good match, but not perfect. So what could happen? They could put her daughter's cells inside her, and those cells could attack the mother. And you have something called graft versus host reaction. And that's a very serious problem, very serious complication. It sometimes happens. So the better the match, the better off you are. So that would be one area. There's another risk here for that same case of leukemia. Remember I said you had to destroy the mother's immune system because that's where the leukemia was, right? That's where the bad cells are. So you give her really high doses of radiation and chemotherapy to wipe out her own immune system, and that's a dangerous step in its own right. And you then have a little space of time where she has no immunity. So if she catches a common cold, it could kill her. She has no immune system because you destroyed it until the umbilical cord stem cells kind of set in motion a new immune system for her. So you're correct. There are real risks. This is not something that's done lightly. But, of course, when you have a terminal situation like leukemia, people are often willing to take these risks, and very often it pays off in a positive way.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great. I think we have one more here, or one or two more. Let's take maybe two more, and then we'll wrap up.
Hello. This is less of a science question, but more of what steps do you think should be taken in order to influence the mass media to step away from embryonic stem cells?
Yeah. Boy, that's a hard question. How can we influence the mass media to give more fair and balanced coverage here? I'm not sure if I have a simple prescription for that. It seems to me that we have, in certain social issues, a systematic bias against us. And I think we just have to be able to explain our position in a reasonable, patient way. If we do that more and more, and if people see, hey, these people who stand for these values, it's not like some kind of extreme craziness, but this is a well thought out, rational, clear, sensible approach, then I think we're likely to get, even more exposure in terms of the mass media. So part of it is the way that we communicate and share these issues amongst ourselves, with our friends, and so on, to build up that perception and that clarity. Because I think that, people on the other side are pretty good at that. And they will also marshal very emotional arguments and say, look at these poor people who have brain cancer, and don't you want to see them cured? And look at the person in the wheelchair. Don't you want them to jump up out of their wheelchair and walk? We have to say, well, of course we do. Of course we do, but we don't want for that to be done at such a price that we have to destroy fellow human beings. That's never going to be right. So, just kind of clarifying the terms, I think that we can gain a hearing. But it's a slow process because, as I say, I do think there's a measure of systematic kind of avoidance of some of these issues in certain segments of the mass media. Thank you.
Okay. So, with that woman with leukemia, basically they destroyed her immune system and recreated it without the leukemia. So do you think that stem cells could be used in creating possible new therapies for HIV/AIDS patients then?
Well, HIV/AIDS is it's a complicated one because you could take a similar approach because, as you know, in HIV/AIDS, you do have a compromised immune system. And so you would say, well, let's just put in a fresh one. But there's another difficulty, which is that very often in HIV/AIDS cases, the virus that causes the AIDS will be present at very low levels, kind of hidden in the neurons of the brain. So if you put in a fresh immune system, there's the chance that you will reinfect it with virus that is still present in the body. So I haven't heard of significant progress using stem cells for HIV/AIDS yet. Doesn't mean it couldn't happen in the future, but you just see it's a more complicated kind of a problem. Thank you. Yes, please, we'll take the last one. I know you were lined up, so.
Thank you for coming, Father. And I wanted to ask you if you're aware of any legislation, either domestically or internationally, that is enacted to protect the embryo in terms of embryonic manipulation or destruction?
We all want just laws here, I think. We all have a sense of the vulnerability of the human embryo. Shouldn't we be protecting him or her? And your question about other countries, the answer would be definitely yes. There are examples, and I'll mention two. Germany and Italy. Now, Germany, you remember what happened in Germany. I mean, there were some atrocious violations that occurred in the name of science, where humans were experimented on, very unpleasant things that happened in Nazi Germany. And because of that, the Germans have a particular sensitivity and concern. So they have an embryo protection law. And in that law, for example, when you do in vitro fertilization and you make embryos in that country, you're not permitted to make extra embryos. So you can't freeze embryos. We have frozen embryos in the United States. Germany has virtually none. Italy, same thing. And Italy, their law also says not only can you only make 3 embryos which must all be implanted into the mother, they also say you're not permitted to experiment on embryos. You're not allowed to destroy embryos for stem cell research. Their law stipulates that. So, those countries, I think, provide us with something of a legislative model that we could potentially follow to to establish a more just situation here in the United States. And I pray for the day that we will see embryo protection laws in the United States of America.
Thank you so much. Guys, one more time for Father, please.
Really,
so much.
Wonderful. They don't do this on,